For years, I have lived by the mantra from that great Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, to organize is to destroy. This will come as no surprise to any of you who have ever visited my office upstairs. But I have recently felt myself pulled gently in the direction of order. You didn't have to sound that surprised. I have evidence. Maybe it has something to do with the political and social and economic chaos of these past few years. Perhaps in the middle of life's chaotic, mindless mayhem, I'm finally developing, at long last, what the poet Wallace Stevens calls the blessed rage for order. The other day, Lee walked into my office, took a look at my desk, and said, "You've been filing." And it's true, that chaotic pile on the desk surface was lower now by a good 2 inches. But I really knew something was up when a day later, Charlene walked in on me organizing my sock drawer. So, maybe it is no surprise that when I started looking at the Beatitudes, these pronouncements of Jesus that start off the Sermon on the Mount, I decided I'd start by putting them in better order. I said, Jesus, no disrespect, this is all super interesting and compelling, but I would find it easier to deal with them if we could reorder them to make them flow a little bit better. These Beatitudes, these peculiar blessings that strike me as maybe Jesus' midrash, Jesus' way of interpreting those powerful words of the prophet Micah: do justice, love, kindness, walk humbly with God. So, I sorted them all out into Beatitudes of love and Beatitudes of justice. Into the love column, I put the poor in spirit, for whom the kingdom of heaven is coming to be. I put those who mourn and will be comforted, the pure in heart who will see God, and the merciful who will obtain mercy. Okay, so then in the justice column, I put the meek, after all, they're going to inherit the earth. Those who hunger and thirst for justice, that was obvious. The peacemakers, those children of God who know that true peace is not possible without justice. And then finally, of course, those who are persecuted for the sake of justice, all in my justice column. But the more I thought of it, the more I realized, and you know, that things are messier than that. Love and justice are so intertwined in the gospel. And these Beatitudes of Jesus, these peculiar blessings, are no exception. So next, I separated them alphabetically. I separated them into the M Beatitudes and into the P Beatitudes. The M's are the meek, those who mourn, the merciful, and into the P column went the poor in spirit, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and the persecuted. Why didn't Jesus think of that? If he'd only spoken English. That didn't help me very much either, by the way. And then it left out those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and justice, and that just didn't seem right. This past Thursday night at Bible study, I invited everybody there to think about the beatitude that seems to speak most directly to where they are now. The results were interesting. If you want, you can take a glance at page 7 in your handy bulletin, where you'll see those Beatitudes, and see if you can find a Beatitude that's closest to your heart. Worst comes to worst, you could just read through the Beatitudes for the remainder of the sermon, which won't do you any harm at all. But I was a little surprised on Thursday Nobody seemed to know exactly what to make of poor in spirit, but certainly we've all known what it is to feel empty. Many chose, "Blessed are those who mourn." And I guess that's hardly a surprise. Many of us have lost loved ones recently, family members, friends, mentors, and those losses run very deep, and they stay with us. But some mentioned mourning for other things, for a relationship that isn't what it was, for a job that isn't what it was, for a lost sense of confidence, maybe, or for the loss of faith in the dependability of the world, a blessed rage for order, maybe. We experience a collective mourning as well, don't we? As we hear of another senseless mass shooting, or another young, innocent black man falling victim to police violence. A kind of mourning that leads to outrage, to action, hopefully. And it felt important to all of us on that Thursday night to realize that a close reading of the verse, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," finds that when Jesus says you'll be comforted, the word translated comforted literally means to call near, to be called near, as though we are called near by friends, by family, called near by God in our mourning. Still, there's something very challenging to me about each of these Beatitudes, and the mourning one is no exception. Friday night, like many of you, I sat and watched as Tyree Nichols' mom, Rovon Wells, was speaking about her son, so brutally murdered a week or so before by 5 officers. It was heartbreaking to listen to as she described how she later found out that he was almost within earshot of her home, calling out, "Mom." And I thought, where will the comfort ever come for her? When is the world ever going to feel safe for her, or okay, or orderly for Mrs. Wells? And if, for that matter, the meek are to inherit the earth, it would be helpful to see that happening somewhere, anywhere. I'm also not sure I can tell those who are persecuted for the sake of justice to rejoice and be glad. If these are blessings, then they are strange blessings. They are, to me, peculiar blessings. But Jesus seems to have something in mind here. Something that's easy for me to miss. Some essential Jesus truth right here in the Beatitudes. Jesus has this way of turning our expectations on their heads, always, of inverting the way the world works, always, to show us the way it ought to work. Jesus, time and time again, shows this countercultural way of disordering things in expectation of a different order, a new order, a different order of being, God's order. God's order. And in that way, maybe the order of the Beatitudes, the way he presents them, makes good sense. Makes good sense. In that way, it certainly makes sense that living a life that privileges the poor, the marginalized, the dispirited, the makers of peace, and the doers of justice might lead those who fancy themselves in power to revile you, to hate you, to persecute you and disparage you, as Jesus warns those followers of his who have drawn near to him on the hill that day. In one of the 100 sermons that John Wesley preached about the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about how strange it is that a meek, merciful, pure, peace-loving person would be treated like that. And he writes, "One would imagine that such a person, so full of genuine humility, so unaffectedly serious, so gentle, so free from selfish design, so devoted to God, such an active lover of people, should be the darling of everyone." But, says Wesley, our Lord was better acquainted with human nature. There was, and there is, something about following the gospel, something about believing what Jesus says about the poor and marginalized, taking seriously the radically inclusive love of God, something about all of that could be threatening to some people, that could well drive people in power and privilege crazy. But that's the order of things that we're called to. That's the order of things that we're called to in God's own blessed rage for order, called by Jesus and called by the prophets and called by the God who pleads to us through the words of the prophet Micah. God has told you, O people, God has told you what is good. And what does God require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. May we do no less.